Hello friends, welcome to a very important discussion today at the Pune International Center. I am Abhay Vaidya, Director PIC. Our distinguished speaker today is Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He will be speaking to us on the government strategy and policies towards achieving $5 trillion economy by 2025. We are also honored to have with us the well-known economist Dr. Ajit Ranade, Vice Chancellor, Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, as the chair for today's session, and senior journalist and author, Mr. Shankkar Aiyar, as a discussant. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal has very impressive credentials, as we all know. He was previously the principal economic advisor to the finance minister for 5 years. He has represented India on the OECD and the G7 and was one of the main architects of the G20's Global Action Plan to coordinate the international response to the COVID-19 pandemic. He has co-authored and edited 6 economic surveys of the Government of India between 2017 and 2022. Before joining the government, Mr. Sanyal spent over 2 decades in financial markets and was global strategist and managing director at Deutsche Bank. An alumnus of Sri Ram College of Commerce, Delhi, he attended Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. He is a visiting scholar at Oxford, fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, London, and a senior fellow of the World Wildlife Fund. A prolific writer and author, Mr. Sanyal was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship in 2007 for his work on urban dynamics, and in 2010, he was named as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in Davos. Dr. Ajit Ranade, the chair for today's session, is a noted economist and trustee, Pune International Center. He received his PhD in economics from Brown University. He is an alumnus of the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad, and IIT Bombay. Prior to his current assignment, Dr. Ranade was the Group Executive President and Chief Economist with the Aditya Birla Group. I must mention that Dr. Ranade is one of the co-authors of Pune International Center's award-winning book, Rising to the China Challenge, Winning Through Strategic Patience and Economic Growth. Mr. Shankkar Aiyar, our discussant today on the panel, is a well-known journalist, political economy analyst, and author. A member of Pune International Center, he writes a column in the Bloomberg Quint and the New Indian Express. His noteworthy books include Accidental India, a history of the nation's passage through crisis and change, on the political and economic history of modern India, Aadhaar, a biometric history of India's 12-digit revolution on the world's largest biometric identity platform, which serves as the foundation of India's digital governance infrastructure. And the third book is The Gated Republic, India's Public Policy Failures and Private Solutions, which analyzes the stark failure of the state in providing the most basic services: water, power, health, education, and security. I would like to mention briefly that Pune International Center is a policy research think tank now in its 11th year. It works in the areas of national security, energy, environment and climate change, social innovation, urbanization and economic reforms, technology and national innovation ecosystem. We regularly hold webinars, book discussions, and discussions on contemporary issues. You may visit our website puneinternationalcenter.org, register and participate in all our public programs. As in all our events, today's discussion also has a Q&A session, and you are welcome to post your questions in the question box. I would now like to invite and hand over the floor to Dr. Ranade. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Abhay, and good evening to everybody, and welcome to this session on the policy and strategy towards the $5 trillion economy. I'm, of course, delighted and privileged to welcome Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. As Abhay said, he's currently now the full-time member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. So welcome, Sanjeev, and of course, welcome good friend Shankkar Aiyar, who's also a fellow Puneite. I, of course, have the pleasant duty of chairing the session. So I will suggest, if Sanjeev agrees, the format could be that Sanjeev, you speak for maybe the first, perhaps, I don't know, 35 minutes or so. Our session, Abhay, is supposed to go on till 7, or is it 7:30?
And 7:15, sir.
Okay. So Sanjeev, if I may suggest to you, maybe for this about 35 minutes, and then we have a conversation. We give floor to Mr. Shankkar Aiyar and maybe a conversation, and then leave some time for interaction with other participants. And as chair, I would simply make the observation that achieving high and sustainable growth, which includes, of course, livelihoods and incomes, but not just incomes, but also growth of jobs and relatively better quality jobs with better earning potential is possibly the biggest priority for our economy. And at a time when we are looking at an international situation where there is a war going on, there is inflation, there are supply chain disruptions, and the world is still trying to recover from the pandemic fully. And now there's already talk about, in many quarters, about stagflation or recession. It's of course a worrying situation. The pandemic has stretched the fiscal resources of most countries. India, of course, was a little more careful about overspending its fiscal resources, but because fiscal resources have been used, that has also resulted in pile up of debts. So how this debt and as interest rates start tightening in response to the inflationary situation, how this debt situation is going to unwind is also going to be a challenging scenario. So in that context, of course, the $5 trillion roadmap and getting to it with relatively higher growth and sustainable and inclusive growth will remain a priority, but of course will require a lot of what should I say, dexterous handling of policy and strategy. So very important, very topical. So I will invite Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal to make his presentation. Over to you, Sanjeev.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying it's a pleasure to be among friends. So first, let me thank Pune International Center and specifically Dr. Vijay Kelkar for inviting me to speak to all of you today. Let me also thank both Ajit and Shankkar, who are old friends. This is the first time, incidentally, I am interacting with Ajit in his new role as Vice Chancellor, no less, of the Gokhale Institute. So congratulations. And look forward to interacting with you more often. Now, the topic I've given is a broad one, and I think that's fair because there's a lot of interesting things happening in a very wide scale, a wide range of things which are interconnected. So in that sense, the topic given to me is sort of a wide plane, so to speak. But I think it's important to give some sense and go back and look at what has happened in the last 2 years and our response to what has happened, particularly through the COVID crisis. It's important because in some sense, it is important to give you a feel of how we think about problem solving, because we are dealing with rapid changes, we are dealing with random shocks, we are dealing with extreme uncertainty in these few years. I mean, the world is always an uncertain place, but the last 2 years certainly have been, most people would agree, particularly uncertain. Perhaps the most uncertain the world has been in the last, in at least 5-6 decades. So in that sense, you'll get a sense of the kind of decision making that we have done over the last few years, why we did what we did, and then maybe terms like Atmanirbhar Bharat, etc. What is the context in which these terms are used will become much more obvious. So obviously, when we came up with the target of a $5 trillion economy in 2025, we had done this prior to COVID. So this was a target. It's a nominal GDP growth rate, sort of target that we had conceived as something that we thought was achievable in nominal terms, and to something that we could aim for. We had not anticipated at that time that the world would be hit with the largest economic shock since the Second World War. But that is partly what I'm going to talk about, which is that the world gets hit ever so often by these big shocks. So let's go back to the March of 2020. What is the information that we had just before we went into this COVID situation? Essentially, we knew that something bad had happened in China. We knew that it had sort of spread to northern Italy, and that it was killing a lot of people. Beyond that, I'm afraid we didn't have very much information. If you remember from that period, WHO was not providing us any clear indications, and the Chinese were being very tight-lipped. So this is the conditions of information that we had to decide what to do about this new threat. So of course, like every government in the world, we called in the experts, and the experts gave us a wide range of things that may be happening. So again, you will all remember from that time, there were experts and virologists and epidemics experts around the world who said, you know, this is nothing much more than a bad flu. And then at the same time, there were a bunch of people who said, oh my God, there are going to be millions of people dead within 3 months. Now, up front, what do we do as policymakers with this wide range of possibilities? So one possible way of going about it is to choose the one which is sort of sounds like the most trustworthy of the forecasts and tune your response to it. I mean, so the Swedish did that, for example. So you get the Swedish model, but you know, the UK also opted for something similar and then changed their mind. So they were initially going for herd immunity, then changed their mind and opted for another model. Singapore did one thing and then changed, and so on and so forth. So there were many back and forth movements in policies in various places in the world because they all face this information problem. But here in India, our problem was the following. We are dealing with 1.35 billion people and with a very limited, resources, administrative capacities, health capacities, and so on. So what do we do? So we took the call that rather than guess where this is all going, we would basically take an agnostic view about what is going to happen in the future. And instead, what we would do, we would hedge for the very worst outcome while iteratively making our way forward by updating information in a Bayesian way. As explained in the economic survey, you can call this a barbell strategy, which we kind of derived from derivatives finance models. Some of you may be familiar with them. But basically, the barbell meant that on one side, you hedged for the worst, and on the other side, you basically updated and made your way by feeling the pebbles along the way. So this is the context in which we did the first lockdown. The idea was not that we knew what was happening, far to the contrary, we shut down because we were hedging for the very worst possible outcome. The possibility that the pessimists in the epidemics experts were correct. But it also bought us some time to begin to build some testing capacity, some quarantining facilities, some also get information from other countries about what was going on. And so after about the first 3-4 weeks, you will remember we began opening things up. And by September, we had opened things up very, very significantly when the epidemic peaked. At the same time, we were sort of finding out information and changing as soon as we could, wherever we could make our way through this sort of cloud of uncertainty. So here comes an explanation of something many people ask us. Why were we opening up in September 2020 when there were many more cases, whereas we were willing to do a full lockdown in end of March when there were very few cases? Well, very simply, because in September 2020, we had much better information. We knew that while it was a dangerous disease, it wasn't quite as dangerous as the very worst outcomes. It was particularly bad for a certain age group with with comorbidities and so on. So we have a much better idea by this point. So we were somewhat more confident of opening things up by this point. Now, our economic response was in the same light. We basically hedged for the very worst outcomes, i.e. provided small amounts of money to the very poor. This was not an attempt to revive the economy in any way. This was just a safety net. We provided free food to 800 million people. We provided lots of liquidity to the business sector to make sure we don't get cascades of default. Now, it is important here to note the difference between our approach and that of many other countries who saw this as primarily a demand shock and wanted to revive the economy as soon as possible. In contrast, here in India, we saw it as primarily a supply shock with some demand impact as well, which needed to be attended to, but it was primarily a supply shock. And this is why, and you remember this from many of my talks at that point in time, we were not very keen on doing this massive reinflation of the economy that many people were advising us to do. And many top experts, including the likes of Nobel laureate Stiglitz, were talking in the media about how measly India was in terms of putting these large packages together, and we were being much more tight-fisted. The reason is because we did not see this primarily as a demand shock. We saw it as a supply shock. There was no point in pumping demand when all the shops were closed. There was no point in pressing the accelerator when you've got your foot firmly on the brake. So we instead iteratively made our way forward. So you will remember throughout that period in 2000, we were doing mini interventions. So rather than do one large $1 trillion reinflation package, we kept doing these mini packages, much to the irritation of some people. But the fact is, that is derived directly from our approach of doing an iterative policy making, i.e. we were responding to a changing situation iteratively rather than guessing where this is going. We were also, throughout this period, making the point that this was a marathon and not a sprint. And therefore, again, we were very willing to conserve our fiscal resources. Even monetary side, we were much more conservative than many others may have wanted us to be. And so by about October, when cases began coming down, we did at that time became much more aggressive, pumped out a lot of investment spending, and that did indeed revive the economy at that point in time. However, of course, we got hit by a second wave, which was pretty strong from the Delta variant in April, May of 2021. Now, in terms of health impact, that was much worse than the first round. And people asked us, oh, why did you then not do a full lockdown again? Well, the reason for that is, by this point in time, even though the health impact of Delta variant was very severe indeed, however, we at least had better information about how to deal with it than we had in the beginning back in March of 2020. So we felt that this could be allowed to be run in a decentralized way in terms of allowing people to go out to particularly state governments, etc., or even municipal governments to take decisions in a decentralized way, because we thought that was more sensible, because you could shut down that part of India that was going through the wave rather than trying to shut the whole thing down all the time, because it would have been very, very costly economically and in some ways unnecessary as well. We also initially had decided to do a decentralized vaccination program. Now, in that particular case, it turned out to be a not great idea, because it meant that many of the states began competing for vaccines and so on, and it made it led to unpleasantness. So we centralized that. But notice again what we are doing. We are iteratively adjusting along the way. Wherever something breaks down, we do adjust to it. It is not because we have some grand plan in the beginning. We are telling you we are iteratively adjusting. So those of you who are familiar with software development, this is very much in line with the agile approach as opposed to the waterfall approach of going about policy making. And by the way, I've talked about this in the economic survey in this year and also in last year, making this explicit. And of course, since then, since the second wave came off, we have been able to open the economy up more or less very significantly. Now there are very few restrictions left. And unlike most other countries, we have some fiscal space, partly because we didn't use it all up in the same way as many other countries may have, or how many experts wanted us to, but also because many of the earlier reforms, for example, GST and so on, those reforms are beginning to flow through, and buoyancy of revenues has been good. We are also managing to do a significant amount of privatization, so some money is coming from that. But leave that aside, revenues buoyancy has been good, so we have fiscal resources. We also continue to have significant amount of financial and monetary resources. So, for example, we had not completely gone out there and opened up the gates on the monetary side. We kept some buffer. We didn't use it all up. And of course, we have a financial system that is ironically cleaner today than it was before the COVID crisis. So yes, there has been some shock, of course, from the COVID, but if we had gone through this COVID cycle with the banking system we had in 2015, then we would have a real bad problem. But thankfully, we had attempted to clean the banks up in 16, 17, and 18, or even to 19. And so as a result of which, the banking system, ironically, has reasonably clean. There may be still some lagged impact from the COVID problems, but by and large, the banks are in a good position to expand if and when the demand for resources. Now, this does not mean that we have left our conservatism and we are just opening things up. We continue to be concerned about macro stability, which is why even though revenues are now coming in, we are very clear that we will basically spend the fiscal space and to support the economy where we can through the infrastructure route. The reason for that, again, is very clear. First, infrastructure spending has a good multipliers in terms of creating second-order impact on demand as well as jobs. But of course, there is another reason. We want to leave behind future generations with assets because we believe that they are these assets are being created by generating debts, and those debts will have to be paid by future generations. So they should also be left with so those debts need to have matching assets. And so we are very clear that demand pumping to the extent it is necessary, a support that is necessary, will to the extent possible be done through infrastructure spending. Now, this doesn't mean that other kinds of spending where necessary will not be done. Right now, for example, certain amount of support may continue to be needed for on the food side. We don't want food shortages happening anywhere in the country. There are, of course, pressures on things like fertilizer prices and things like that from oil prices spiking up. So there are other pressures, but we intend to be reasonably conservative about it. In fact, this is also true on the monetary side, where you have seen the Reserve Bank now move into a tightening bias. So you can see that we continue to be concerned and quite conservative on macroeconomic stability. And in fact, through the cycle, when we had the opportunity, we also had accumulated reserves. We are now burning them a little bit on the margin, but still we have 600 billion plus worth of foreign exchange reserves standing in there. So that's where we are at. Now comes the issue of growth. In the end, let it be adequately clear, you can debate however you might want about the need for jobs. But the fact is, growth is a necessary, even if you can debate the sufficient part, it is a necessary condition for growth. So I'm not a great votary on the theory of jobless growth. You can get growth with more jobs, you can get jobs with a little less more jobs, but growth is absolutely necessary for generating jobs. You can debate the exact nature of this however you wish. You will find it quite difficult to convince me that you can have strong growth and no generation of jobs. So growth is a necessary, sometimes not sufficient condition for jobs. And therefore, getting growth going onto a higher plane is a very vital thing. Now, what can you do looking ahead into the future about growth? Now, obviously, the 2025 target for a 5 trillion economy may have to be extended a little bit. My sense is not by a great deal, but still it'll have to be probably extended a little bit. But still, I think a $5 trillion economy will happen sooner than people, the sort of critics think. And that requires us to adjust again to a post-COVID world. Now, the post-COVID world, let me be clear, in my estimation, is not a re-inflation of the pre-COVID world. This post-COVID world will have its own geopolitics, clearly. It'll have its own technology, it'll have its own consumer behavior, its own supply chains, and so on. And here too, there is the issue of uncertainty. How do we know how all of this is going to evolve? I mean, somebody will say artificial intelligence is the thing to do. Somebody will go on about, I don't know, cryptocurrencies and whatever. My view is that while, yes, the government may have to take a few, choosing champions occasionally where it may have to do it, but by and large, the real issue is to keep an economy that is open and flexible. So the real story, even going forward, if you had to think about it, how do we deal with the uncertainty of the post-COVID world? Well, the first point is that there has to be flexibility, particularly of factor markets where we can find it. So we have systematically tried to open, liberalize, and improve factor markets to the extent the political space provides. Sometimes, of course, the political space is constrained, as was the case in agricultural markets. But wherever we could, we have opened things up. Whether in terms of opening up large sectors, whether it's drones or the cartography sector, or in trade finance, we opened up the factoring markets, or removing all kinds of archaic telecom regulations on the BPO sector, which incidentally has already triggered a boom in the IT BPO sector, and so on and so forth. So first of all, open up as many sectors as makes sense. Two, where possible, privatize, so that, again, flexibility is important. So privatize, so Air India was done. Hopefully we will start the process of at least listing LIC soon, and so on and so forth. In fact, I think we are doing this listing as we speak. And so that is what is going on. So wherever we can, open it up, liberalize, and so on. But even here, there is a barbell. On one side, flexibility, but you have to take into account the other side of the barbell, which is resilience. And so you cannot think of flexibility in terms of the static neoclassical view of flexibility. We are in a complex world where there's lots of uncertainty and shocks, and you may have to take nuanced views and interventions. And so in this and make choices. So in this context, for example, we made a strategic choice that we didn't want to join RCEP. Now, this doesn't mean that we are against free trade deals. We just judged that RCEP specifically does not work to our national interests. Many people criticized us and said, oh my God, this is a return to import substitution going backward and so on. Not at all. We are quite happy signing free trade agreements. We've just signed one with Australia, one with UAE. We are pursuing very strongly one with the UK and the US and so on. So we have entirely in favor of having an architecture of free trade, but that architecture has to be put in place in terms of what we are guessing will be the architecture of the post-COVID world, which fits our geopolitical and our economic needs. So it's, as I said, flexibility, but in a different dimension from the neoclassical way of thinking about flexibility. We also have to take into account the idea of resilience. The same logic applies incidentally to Atmanirbhar Bharat. Atmanirbhar Bharat is not a return to pre-1991 import substitution. Let me be absolutely clear about it. The idea of Atmanirbharta is about leveraging domestic strengths to compete in international markets or to protect our interests where there is some geostrategic or defense or some such reason. And let me illustrate this absolutely clearly. For example, we have a very, very competitive pharmaceuticals industry. But this pharmaceuticals industry, we discovered, in fact, through the course of the COVID crisis, was heavily dependent on certain inputs, certain APIs that came from single foreign sources, particularly from China. Now, the old style thinking of efficiency would be that, so what? This is the most efficient way, let's open it up and get on with it. However, if you take a resilience view of things, this is clearly too dangerous. We clearly need to be able to find either multiple foreign sources or, where possible, to be able to produce at least some of the key ingredients onshore. This is not about, xenophobia, return to pre-1991 type of import substitution and sort of looking inwards. Far from it. This is protecting the interests of a highly internationally competitive industry and making sure that its resilience and protection from random shocks is tempered. So that is what we are trying to do, that its resilience is maintained against shocks. So the same thing is true for, by the way, chips. We have a very competitive automobiles industry. Over the last 2 years, it has been hit by this chip shortage, as a result of which many of you who have attempted to buy a car in the last 18 months would have noticed, there are long waits, 7, 8, 9 months to get a car. That's not because our cars sector is, don't have the capacity. It's just that a certain ingredient is not available. Now, if we need to consequently encourage some, manufacturing in India, and that requires certain amount of industrial policy, then in my view, we should be willing to put in that industrial policy where necessary. This is also true for, by the way, the PLI schemes. The production linked incentive is a response to a fundamental problem in the architecture of Indian economic policy, where we kind of eulogize or almost worship smallness. The point about having a active MSME sector is that it creates an ecosystem and genetic variation and innovation of activity that from time to time generates one or at least a handful of big winners. And then it again, hopefully over time, generates some innovation and another bunch of winners. So the MSME sector should be seen not as a competitor, as very often we do in India, to the large sector, but instead as except in a few sectors like retail, maybe where there's competitiveness, but the MSME sector is to be seen as a place for a kindergarten for big companies, not a holding place for dwarfs. So since it's a kindergarten, we need to create sort of pathways for rapid expansion where in certain sectors where we thought scale mattered. And so that's what the PLI scheme is about, is allowing scale so that they can compete in global markets and sort of undoing to some extent the biases we have in our policy where scale is somehow discouraged. So that is where we are at. How do we think about the world going forward? Well, first of all, very, very important that we think of the future, not in trying to so much guess about exactly how it will pan out, but by creating both flexibility on one hand and investing in resilience on the other. The important part here, however, there are many, many things that still need to be done, some of which we are dealing with. One of them, of course, is building out the physical infrastructure for some of this economic activity to happen, and hence again a direction of fiscal resources towards it in a very pointed way. But there are other things we need to do in the next 25 years of reforms. The last 25 odd years of reforms, or 30 years of reforms, if I may say so, was really about opening up the economy, driving up, say, the animal spirits of the private sector, getting the startups going, getting a sort of culture of innovation going in this country. And over the last 3 decades, I would say, to some extent, we have succeeded. One can always quibble at the margins, but I think we genuinely have a new sort of entrepreneurial class spirit, etc., that has developed. But for whatever it's worth, the last 25 years, reforms essentially meant liberalization. Essentially, it was about the withdrawal of the Indian state. So what do we want to do over the next 25 years? I, of course, talked about resilience and flexibility and so on. But really, at some level, the next 25 years of reforms has got to be about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do. So the last 25 years, stopping the Indian state from doing the things it shouldn't do. But what about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do in the next 25 years has got to be the focus. There, of course, some part of it is about fiscal infrastructure. But I think there are two areas that I personally think are absolutely critical. First of all, we need to get serious about municipal governance. So I think that is one big area. The second is about enforcement of contracts and cleaning up the legal system. This is a very old bugbear of mine. And I believe that the fastest, the best investment India can make is in terms of dramatically reforming and expanding our legal system. Because if we are dealing with a largely market-driven economy, if we're dealing with continuous innovation, we are thinking of an economy based on creative destruction and so on, then basically, in this sort of messy world, the only anchor that is there is essentially enforcement and validity of contracts. Unfortunately, our legal system is unable to enforce contracts on time. And this is a very major issue. So let me end by saying, if there was one area of investment that I would advocate, it would be investing in India's legal system. With that, let me stop.
Thank you, Sanjeev. Of course, a very broad canvas, and thanks for articulating, and especially those two areas which you specifically identified towards the end, judicial reform and municipal governance. So let me straight away ask Shankkar to come in as a discussant. Over to you, Shankkar.
Thank you, Sanjeev. That was a very interesting presentation of where we were and where we are headed. The approach reminded me of Deng Xiaoping's line, crossing the river by feeling the stones. And let me posit that we are still not out of the troubled areas. As of this morning, we know a lot of the issues that are haunting the global economy will also haunt the Indian economy in the terms of, I mean, China might see a contraction, Europe will definitely see a contraction, US, there's a talk between, the toss-up is between stagflation and recession. And these are all challenges. But when we look at India and the $5 trillion target, it's not the exact quantum of the target, but as to how we sustain growth across a time frame. That's generally the idea why the target was created. So how do we look at the emerging challenges? I mean, you know, the old world order is sort of unraveling. The supply chains are being disrupted. Do we see us benefiting from the disruptions? Do we see us being able to produce and sell as much as we do? Because ultimately, that's what the nominal GDP is about, that we produce and sell and consume. And then an attendant question, which is more important, is for the longest time, India's challenge has been that over 40% of the population lives on 16% of the GDP, on the national income. So how are we planning to pull those people, those dependent on the farm economy, to come up? Because that's where the I won't say low height fruit, but it is that challenge that will determine how we can sustain growth. So I'll stop at these two, and then I have a couple of other points that I will come back to if Dr. Ranade allows me
to. Sure. So thanks, Shankkar. But let me also add a few questions for Sanjeev. So Sanjeev, I think I'll propose that let's have one or two questions between the three of us before we open it up for others to join in. I hear what you said about the importance of being open. So openness was very important. And openness, along with Atmanirbhar, you emphasized, was different from the very old days of import substitution. And of course, it was not, a closed economy approach. You also emphasized agility and resilience. I want you to actually comment on the following. I'm referring to the period before the pandemic. So 3 or 4 years before the pandemic. So growth as an imperative is, of course, is known, but how do we look at this challenge that the growth requires investment, and investment to GDP ratio has actually been somewhat stagnant in the 3 or 4 years even prior to the pandemic. Then if you look at labor force participation rate, ultimately GDP expansion is essentially expansion of labor in productive activities and investment, which is capital. But labor force participation actually has been going down. Some of it is because of the pandemic, but I believe there's a longer term trend. So today is something like 40%, and for women, it's down to 20%. So these two very serious structural features of the Indian economy, how do you see us addressing this impediment? Because I think any growth process has to address an increase in investment spending, whether from public or private sector, and an increase in labor force participation.
So let me say that they're all linked issues. My own view is that if you want a 20-year growth cycle, you effectively need all countries that have sustained it, including, by the way, the Western countries in the late 19th and early 20th century, when they were high growth countries. They all had broadly the same dynamic. They all had somewhat elevated investment rates, partly pushed by public investment, and then, of course, by private investment. Both of them were drivers of growth. If you go back even to, everybody knows about China and Japan and so on. But if you go back and look at Britain in the late 19th century, it was doing massive. The Victorian England was a construction site. In fact, if you go to London, even today, the city is still functioning on Victorian engineering, whether it's the underground railway network, and all of those things were done in the late 19th century. So you do need to create a dynamic of high growth. Now, what does this mean? First of all, let it be clear, you need fiscal resources to be available. And two, you require a single-minded approach in which this generated fiscal resources is driven towards the end of creating investment. So this is one part of that story. So in India, at least, what we have done is we spent a fair amount of effort in the pre-pandemic period fixing the taxation system, right? A lot of crackdown on black money, a lot of crackdown on all kinds of other things, and of course the introduction of GST, which whenever we did it was going to be painful, but we did it, right? So that was one thing, and you can see in whether we succeed or not, I'll let you judge. But the logic of this is this: we need to create a taxation system that is naturally buoyant, so that as the growth picks up, it sort of feeds itself, and a single-minded approach in which you direct a lot of that excess resources into infrastructure, both physical and also soft infrastructure such as medical and other things as well. So I'm taking that in a broad sense. So that is one part of it, investment on the public side. Now, the private investment similarly has to be driven by, first, a culture of risk-taking, which has to go beyond this idea that investment is always done by an existing set of preordained industrialist houses. So you need to create a culture of startups and so on. So again, that is where we are coming from. And of course, you need a financial system that can support all this risk-taking, including a lot of it going wrong. So again, you can see where why we were cleaning up the banking system. Again, a very painful thing to do. Anybody who's attempting to clean a banking system up will know how painful it is, and we ourselves went through it in the years 17, 18, 19. And also sort of parallel to it, the introduction of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which was at least to start with painful, because you're going to have to shut down companies, you're going to liquidate companies, and some very large companies were liquidated. I mean, companies like Jet Airways, right? Not trivial companies, SR, and so on. So these are companies that were done. Now, note that this is absolutely critical to get this architecture of both private and public investment in there. And of course, added to that, we also radically simplified and lowered corporate taxes. So that is the architecture we built. Now, whenever you put this architecture in place, you will have to go through a period of pain. GST is painful to introduce, IBC is painful to introduce, cleaning up banks is painful to introduce. All of those are going to be painful whenever you did it. And those were the years we did it. So we saw our growth slowed down. But the proof of the pudding in some ways that we were doing the right thing is, despite 2 years of going through, COVID, which everybody will agree was, a really random, painful thing to happen to the world economy. I think on the other side of it, we are still standing with tax collections still growing reasonably well. We have exports doing reasonably well. Our infrastructure, except for urban infrastructure, which is a real problem, but I think our infrastructure backbone generally is continued to improve. Our highways are now, for the most part, decently good. Our airport connections, thanks to Udan, etc., is also decently good. Telecoms, well, it is good and not good, in the sense we now need to get on with it and introduce 5G. But again, those investments efforts are also going in. And now with Gati Shakti, hopefully we'll be able to link all these things together as well. So I think we are putting a sort of architecture in there, which we feel is flexible enough and can allow a period of high investment-driven, export-driven growth. Now, be very clear that this is not terribly dissimilar to what East Asia did in a particular period of time. Now, the exact details of it will be different. We may, for example, not get heavily into exporting certain kinds of electronics. We may export more, services. So the exact mix of goods, the exact supply chains may be different because of changing geopolitics. I'm not getting into that, but the model is roughly the same. Invest heavily, generate growth, and orient it towards exports where you can. So it is not too difficult to understand what we're trying to do. We also think that this sort of growth generates jobs. Since we talked about labor force, if you generate jobs, it will suck in, it will cause that suction. And as far as the poor is concerned, simultaneously do strategic interventions in order to solve certain problems. So whether it is toilets was one problem we went for, then we went for housing. So there's a huge effort to create, rural but also urban housing for the very poor. Now we are attacking water. And by the way, many of these have important implications for labor force participation for women. So with that, let me stop and pass it back.
Okay, in fact, since you mentioned, so basically you're saying the hard work of banking cleanup and GST and all that was done prior to the pandemic, and perhaps that was partly responsible for investment beginning to slow down, but now hopefully it's coming back. You also mentioned that exports are important. And in fact, indeed, this year, our exports have been all-time record high and a very good bounce up from last year. So there's a question from Shashank Shukla, and this was something, I was also thinking of asking. While we are signing FTAs with many countries, do you think it is time to rethink about RCEP? Because, we almost signed and then walked out of RCEP at the last moment. And since you mentioned the East Asian growth opportunities, the East Asia growth, do you think India should be less defensive about not joining RCEP and be a little more offensive about looking at the export opportunities in this part of the world?
Well, you have to remember that we have free trade agreements for pretty much every RCEP member with one exception. And so joining RCEP is essentially only about having a free trade agreement with that one country, where we have certain reservations about non-market practices, which we think will not play to our interests today. Maybe there may be a future date in which the dynamics may be different and we'll be open-minded about it. But at this point in time, we don't think it will play to our national interests and to our natural strengths. On the other hand, we think, for example, a market like the UK, where we are pursuing it, may be more amenable to a free trade, export-oriented market. That doesn't mean we won't import from them. That's, that has to work both ways. And that is also true, for example, with Australia. There are things we can export to them, but there are natural resources from them that we want as well. So it must work both ways. And so that's why I said, while we believe in openness and market and market economics, do not confuse it with a the neoclassical theory. We are not neoclassicists. Our worldview is much more driven by East Asian mercantilism combined with Austrian economic views of creative destruction.
Okay, can I just jump in 1 minute?
Yes.
Ajit,
Shankkar, I was going to ask you. Yeah. Yes.
So, Sanjeev, the point of my two questions, one was that, India has been perpetually haunted by this concept of additionality of resources. So investments matter, and foreign direct investment matters, and foreign portfolio investment matters. Export matters because, roughly depending on which year, we will be close to 20% of the GDP. So when you have such uncertainty ahead, is there any iteration on those fronts? And the second, less exotic question about what happens to agriculture. I recognize that there was a political resistance to opening up the farm markets and the new farm laws, but the opportunity exists in the states, and it baffles me that if the BJP is in power with or without allies in 18 states, why it couldn't pursue those reforms, or indeed the labor reforms, or indeed power reforms in those states. Because these are critical issues. When you have 40% of the population living on 16% of the national income, that's an area that I think calls for some iteration.
So you asked me about, having an export orientation in a sort of, in an uncertain world where export markets may be going up. That's what I understood from your question. Okay, obviously the world is an uncertain place. So consequently, we understand that export markets are uncertain by definition. But what we do want to do, that we think that there are certain export markets like, the US and so on, where we do want to integrate with them. There are other countries where we already have free trade agreements. So, and also there are sectors like, for example, the services sectors like IT, BPO sector, software and all that, where we have certain competitive advantages. So we are investing in them. This is not to suggest that the architecture of any of these sectors may be in future have to be very flexible, because some sectors will die and new sectors will emerge. New competitors will emerge. At no point in time should we imagine that other countries are also not watching all of this and adjusting. So all of this means that is the reason we need inside India to build the infrastructure, backbone, and to be allowed for creative destruction, allow for a financial system that can finance all of this activity. By the way, it's astounding that we aspired to be global players and did not allow for trade finance factoring till very recently. How could we even imagine that we were going to go out there, and trade finance factoring is the most basic of finance tools, but we had all kinds of restrictions on it. So these are the kinds of things that we are doing, and of course, encouraging the creation of lots of startups. So this is very important that you create this whole culture of risk taking, so that some of them will succeed. Just like all the unicorns, everybody got excited about 100 unicorns. But let us all be clear that of these 100 unicorns, I would be very surprised if maybe 50% of them are still around in 10 years' time. It's quite possible half of them are going to die. But so what? The 50% that will survive will be many multiples of what it is today. And that is what really, that churn of creative destruction, we have to allow for that, allow continuously new ideas, new companies to churn. So in the same logic, we have to allow that to happen to our exports. We have to allow new sectors to emerge, old sectors to die, and continuously churn it. We have suddenly become exporters of iPhones. And, nobody would have imagined that we were going to be the second biggest place after China that exports iPhones, but we are. And we have done it in a relatively short period. So let us not kick ourselves too much that, we missed the bus here and missed the bus there. There's no bus. This is not about getting into buses. This is about continuous churn and being able to participate in that churn, number one. Agriculture is obviously an important part of our economy for multiple reasons. One is, in a resilience perspective, it is an important sector because in the end, we need to feed 1.35 billion people. We can't be important. So since we have a resilience lens as well, other than an efficiency lens, so agriculture has to be supported in some way. I agree it doesn't need to employ 40% of our labor force. That requires certain kinds of reforms. Some of those reforms will now proceed at the state level as they are. Now, I can't answer for the political class because obviously they have certain imperatives, etc., which is for them to answer. But let me say, even many of the opposition states are going ahead and doing some very good reforms. And as we speak, it is interesting that Indian agriculture is now actually exporting quite aggressively abroad. Wheat, for example. So, Indian agriculture can compete. But you have to create the infrastructure and you have to create the culture and the microstructures of it. So even the fact that we had this whole debate in India about having agricultural markets, and even if there are some partial sort of opening ups happening, you can already see the benefits of that in those places where opening up has happened. And I am quite certain that, in the end, what will work is seeing by doing, because those places that benefit will, the rumors of that place will spread and eventually everybody will want to move on to that. So, in fact, that is already happening because in many places, like in Rajasthan and so on, wheat purchases in the MSP mandis is dropped because people are finding it far more lucrative to sell it to the grain traders who in many cases are exporting it.
Sanjeev,
there's one more point that you made, which was, one second, Ajit. There's one point which is Ajit agreed with, and I, like you, I also, it's a long-term bugbear of mine, which is the legal infrastructure. Now, understandably, some of it involves in the tension between the three arms of government. The issue of judges' appointment and stuff. But you were involved with some amount of reforms in departmental issues. You would have noticed that, and recently the Chief Justice mentioned this, that the governments are nearly 50% of the litigation in courts is by governments. So when we talk about cleaning up the legal infrastructure, when we talk about judicial reforms, where does that stand in terms of the iteration?
So, of course, there is some amount of administrative cleanups that are also needed. For example, the whole culture of continuously appealing against any judgment against the government of any kind happens routinely with tax cases, for example. Now, some amount of restraining has happened there by, for example, putting limits of whatever 1 crore or whatever it is, that unless you are above this certain limit, you cannot appeal it. So there have been administrative steps that have been taken. But in the end, there has to be a general culture that has to change, and it will happen slowly. I do think, at least even in the 5 years I have been in government, I can see that people have now accepted the fact that this unnecessary appealing by governments or being unnecessarily litigious by government, at least the principle of this is accepted by most bureaucrats. Now, the culture of it has not yet changed, but the principle of it now is widely accepted. Certain administrative measures, particularly by the tax authorities, have mitigated it a little bit, maybe not to the extent necessary, but it is better than it used to be. But you know, a lot of the cases are actually related to something else, which people forget. A lot of the cases involve actually personnel. You know, cases about promotions, cases about postings and transfers, and stuff like that. You'll be surprised how many of the cases. Now, frankly, my own view is much of this should not even reach the legal system. You know, in most countries, these are dealt administratively inside the executive itself. If the executive, if a particular civil servant has a gripe about where he or she has been posted, there should be an appellate tribunal within the bureaucracy that resolves the issue. But this requires an understanding of the judiciary that they will not take on these cases. Today, what will happen, even if you created an appellate jury, and there, by the way, our administrative tribunals exist, even no matter what happens, the losing party will essentially take it to the judiciary. The government itself does it. So in some cases, the government should stop. But even otherwise, I think, you know, this every trivial case ending up in the High Court has got to stop. And that the judiciary has to be willing to, you know, take that stand.
Sanjeev, looking forward, see, of course, this 5 trillion number is a very important and popular, what should I say, if I can call it a meme or a kind of a focal number, because I think before the Prime Minister introduced it, the word trillion was not so much in common parlance. So that's a good focus and good target. It's roughly about 60% more than where we are today. So looking at the future, what future sectors, you know, in particular, would you like to comment on the growth potential of sectors like renewable energy? We talk a lot about hydrogen and the combination of hydrogen and solar and its potential in various sectors, including transportation. And secondly, the fact that the digital, you know, as the economy grows, as the economy matures, that part of the GDP which is attributed to the digital footprint keeps expanding. So digital actually also is a very big growth driver. So on these two particular sectors, how do you see that contributing to the growth impetus? That's renewable and digital.
So first of all, let me make a qualified statement. I'm a complexity theory economist. So by definition, I see the future as uncertain, and the ability of civil servants to be able to predict the future is by definition points highly suspect. So I would, first of all, please take any forecast about the future I make with many pinches of salt, because if I knew where the world was going, I would be Elon Musk. I wouldn't be sitting here. Now, having made that disclaimer, I will say that there are certain sectors where we certainly want growth. Renewable energy is one of them. Even if one leaves aside Paris Club, climate change, and so on, the fact of the matter is we are a hydrocarbon poor country. We have very little gas and oil and some coal, but you know, it's not the best quality, and it's also not that much either. So the very fact that we want to move away from a carbon-based economy to something else is, if anything, the only common sense thing to do for a country that's got few carbon resources but lots of sunshine. So, you know, and it happens to be our peak energy requirements coincide with when the peak sunshine is. I mean, we use, what do we use our energy for? Mostly for cooling type things. And so consequently, it happens to be, it coincides with our summer when we have the most sunshine. And the little bit of time where it rains, it's no problem. We can run our hydroelectric. So in some ways, unlike, for example, say the West, which needs its peak energy at the time when it maybe gets its least sunshine, we have in some ways a simpler problem. The problem, of course, is that solar technology, although it has advanced dramatically in the last decade, no doubt about it, in some ways is still not quite there for many things. And it still needs some support. It still deals badly with peak spikes. It still requires a lot of investment, for example, in storage. And there's a whole host of complications about this issue. So there are some technology frontiers that need breaking through. So in some ways, what we need here in India is not a willingness, we have no problem moving on to completely renewable based system, because it happens to be that is what our natural resources are. And of course, that would, it would save us foreign exchange and many other things. So there are some technological issues we need to think through, which is why we are still, at least on policy, in a policy sense, we want to maintain a bouquet of sources for now. So we will continue to retain certain amount of thermal capacity. We will invest into nuclear energy in many places as well. So that should be also part of our expansion. And so we are keen on retaining a bouquet of energy till all the renewables become completely sort of reliable. And Europe, for example, itself is jumped to renewable without allowing for enough of the transition and allowing for enough of the bouquet. So now they're having all kinds of problems when Russia with this Russia issue. Anyway, the technologies that may work well. What do I think? Well, I think first of all, remember the lithium business is all about actually movable energy. Because lithium, why do we care about lithium? Because it's light. So I understand it's the key thing you want to have in your cell phone or on something that is mobile, like a car, yes. But the bulk of energy is not needed for that kind of thing. Bulk of energy uses static. So there are two major technologies that could do the job. One of them is hydrogen. And so you can see there are, for example, the Amanis, Adanis, and some of the big industrial houses in this country are investing into it. So let's see what happens with that. Hydrogen has one advantage, is that you can also, it is very scalable. You can do it in very small scales as well. So if you can set up a small plant in a remote area, you don't need to, create complex supply chains, grids, and other things. A remote village can create its own storage using hydrogen once this. Of course, there are issues about flammable and all that. But again, since you're not moving this around in a car, then it's not so dangerous. You can put it outside the village or whatever it is you want to do. It can be safe enough. So I think hydrogen, green hydrogen, as you know, many people are therefore investing in. That's the logic. The other technology is less known, which is iron-ion storage. Now, everybody knows about lithium-ion storage. Even some people are trying sodium as well. But actually, there is some breakthroughs very recently in iron-ion technology. The problem with iron-ion technology is, of course, that it's ridiculously heavy. You can't move around blocks of iron around, which you can with lithium. But that's no problem if it's static. And as it happens to be, India is actually very well endowed in iron ore. So this is not, and anyway, iron ore is common worldwide, but India itself happens to have lots of it. So this is something that we could look at. Some very important technological breakthroughs have happened recently. It's not yet there, but if this particular technology breaks through, then that will be also another very good way of storing technology. So static energy storage is what we would be a big thing for us if we can break through with that. Because then even with solar panels of today, which are not very efficient, by the way, there is some technologies that break through there. But even with today's solar technologies, if we can crack the storage part, we would actually be able to move quite far in many energy areas.
All right. So I think we need to wrap up now, but I just want to mention one point, which if you could just very briefly respond, because no growth is possible without investment. And you mentioned public investments, but also investment in not physical capital, but human capital. So just a brief, maybe some policy strategy thinking about human capital, skilling, education.
So there are several bits to this. Schooling, of course, basic education and all that, I think, is widely accepted. I don't think I have anything much to add to what is very generally accepted. But I think in the higher echelons, I think there are a few things that I think we need to be more cognizant of. First of all, I think we simply don't take apprenticeship seriously. And I think the skilling that our higher education does is, in some ways, we have taken on elite education as being the main mode of providing higher education. Whereas it should be, in fact, if anything, the exception. And even in the case of apprenticeship education, you can have certain areas that are elite. Because learning by doing in a rapidly changing environment is the best thing you can do. By the time the curriculum of the universities change, the technology is come and gone. So it is simply impractical to expect the university system to deal with this. So my own view is we've got to find ways of providing the apprenticeship machinery, not only the capacity, but in some ways the respect, find ways of certification, which is taken by, for example, even in this, in this building, I'm right now in the Prime Minister's Economic Council, but I sit in Niti Aayog. So either in Niti Aayog or in Prime Minister's Economic Council, if I tried to hire somebody purely on grounds that that person is very good at doing a certain activity, even though they do not have the masters, bachelors, and other degrees, the government rules only will not allow me to do it. So supposing, and same thing with universities. For example, if you wanted to get Mark Zuckerberg to take a course on social media in any of India's universities, he could not do it because he didn't finish his Harvard degree. I mean, right now they have now made some minor changes, so it's slightly better than before, because I think you're allowing some professors of practice to be taken in.
New education policy is much more liberal about these things.
Yeah, but I think we need to be really liberal about it. So that is
one. I'm going to invite Dr. Kelkar to have the last word before we wrap up the session. So, Dr. Kelkar, if he's there, would you like to come in? I don't know if he's Abhay. Is Dr. Kelkar around?
I think he's muted himself.
Abhay, you're on mute.
Yeah. So he'll join in, but you could go ahead.
We can't leave Sanjeev without a question from Dr. K. So, anyway, so maybe, this is a topic which actually is a favorite of Dr. K. So I'll ask it for you. You mentioned two things which you mentioned toward the end of your opening remarks were municipal governance. And there has been several mentions in even the question box that municipalities or the third-tier government struggle for funding. So how can we have better municipal governance or better municipal governments without a source of funding? So unless we have reform, the finance commissions have made some provisions to give directly to the third tier, but unless we have property tax reform, what other route is there to ensure better municipal services?
So, well, obviously we need sources of taxes at the municipal level. But let me say that one of the things that strikes me as a person who has been through, has visited many newly emerged countries. And the thing that strikes you is that Indian cities and even villages are extremely poorly managed, even for our per capita income. So when I was, let's say, 30 years younger, I would have, if somebody had asked me, our cities are badly managed, I would have said, yeah, we are a poor country. That's what, when we become a little richer, the cities will be better run. Now, 30 years later, we are significantly richer than we were in 1991. But our cities are not any better run than they used to be. Whereas if you go and look at, say, Vietnam, which has a similar per capita income, there's no question that Ho Chi Minh City or Hanoi and all these cities are very well, much better run, and the quality of life is much higher than is in our case. Or Indonesia, for example, its per capita income isn't that much higher than ours, but and even when it was at our level, 20 years ago, it was pretty, the cities were much better run than ours are. So my own view is that this is not a poverty problem. And even the resources in which those cities run are usually quite poor. Many of them don't have property taxes. Many of them are running on monies just comes from below and so on. In my view, the real problem is that we spend a large amount of time and energy thinking out the governance structures, not the governance objectives. So whenever I go to discussions about cities and governance and so on, most of it is going, oh, you know, we should have some complex change in taxation system, or we need a mayoral system, or third tier of government, the elections have to happen. So it's all in the form, not the actual objective of what has to be done. Whereas every form of government works in the rest of the world. The US has, you know, strong mayors. There are other countries with weak mayors. In some cases, the central government runs the cities. Some places they have state governments running the cities. In every single combination, the cities are better run than ours.
Okay.
Okay. So therefore, we are wasting our time on having this debate at all. What we need to be doing is to give clear things that we want to do, not who should be doing it, should not be the issue. We need clearer, cleaner roads. We need better architecture and public spaces. Right? So we've got to get away with this somewhat theory going around issue of what the structure should be. The point is that we should be clear who is the guy who's supposed to do it. If we decide it is the DM or the municipal commissioner and the bureaucrat who's going to do it, let's be clear he's the guy who's going to do it. If we decide that it's the mayor who's supposed to do it, let the mayor do it. Our system now is that we were never clear what the DM is supposed to do. Then we added a mayor who is also not clear what they're supposed to do. Now there's a whole bunch of municipal councillors who also don't know what they're supposed to be doing. So this is the problem. Every system can be made to work if people are clear who's supposed to do it.
All right. So anyway, on that note, I think we really have reached our almost end. So Abhay, should we wait for Dr. Kelkar or can we wrap up now?
We've lost him because of some bandwidth issues. So
okay. So Sanjeev, you have covered. So let me just. You just covered a whole range of issues. So I'm not going to try and summarize, but very interesting that you have some strong views. For example, this what you said just now, but it's not a property tax issue. It's not a question of. It's actually a question of objectives and being clear about what goals. Or when you said about the ion technology, the fact that most of our renewable energy can be in static, not mobility. These are all very nice, innovative ideas. And thank you very much. Thank you, Shankkar. Also, Shankkar also is an encyclopedia of questions and issues. Just these, 60, 75 minutes is simply not enough to capture all possible issues. But I think Sanjeev did an excellent job of covering the major aspects. So thanks again on behalf of Pune International Center for coming and joining us today. And thanks to all the participants for being with us. I think I'll hand it over to Abhay to close the session. Over to you, Abhay.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you very much, Mr. Sanyal, for taking the time out and giving us such a wonderful insight into the economic policies approach and the clarity that you brought in. Just to mention, you spoke about the reforms needed in the municipal bodies, and this resonates so well with a city like Pune, which has an IT and services hub, and we feel it very strongly, and we really hope that the municipal services really improve, at least in Pune. And just to give a point of information to our audience about our next program, it is relating to the municipal body, and this is in Marathi. This is our Marathi program called Pune Samvad, and the discussion will be on a holistic discussion on Pune's water supply and demand. Pune is a rapidly expanding metropolis, and we are going to discuss this. Our discussant is, the speaker is Professor Vijay Paranspe, a renowned environmentalist. We have Mr. Vinod Bodankar, water expert, and the Director General of Yashda, Shri S. Chokalingam will be the chair for this session. This is on Saturday, 7th May at 11 a.m. All are welcome to join and participate in this program. With this, I would like to thank Mr. Sanyal. Thank you very much, Dr. Ranade, for chairing this session and enriching this discussion and curating the questions. And thank you very much, Shankkar, for your participation in this program and giving your thoughts and insights. Thank you very much. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
you
Thank
soon.
you. Thank you. See you.